What you are about to hear represents the single most consequential geopolitical transformation unfolding in the Indo-Pacific right now, and almost no one in the Western media is talking about it. While American analysts fixate on China's military buildup and obsess over Taiwan contingencies, one nation has systematically restructured the entire regional order without firing a single shot, without triggering American sanctions, and without appearing on a single primetime news broadcast as a strategic threat. The transformation that has occurred over the past 15 years represents nothing less than the quiet displacement of American influence across the Pacific Island nations, Southeast Asian maritime zones, and critical infrastructure networks that determine who controls the ocean that covers 1/3 of Earth's surface. We are watching the construction of a new regional architecture that will define the 21st century balance of power, and it is happening in plain sight while Western strategists remain fixated on scenarios that may never materialize. What I am going to show you tonight is how one nation leveraged economic connectivity, institutional patience, and civilizational memory to build influence infrastructure that the United States cannot match, cannot counter, and increasingly cannot even comprehend. Three questions will drive everything that follows. First, how did this nation construct a network of dependencies that now encompasses 43 countries without triggering the containment response that American power traditionally deploys against rising competitors? Second, what does this transformation mean for the military balance, trade architecture, and alliance structures that have defined the Pacific since 1945? And third, what happens when the United States finally recognizes what has occurred and attempts to reverse a process that may already be irreversible? There are no comfortable answers tonight. The structural analysis reveals a pattern that has repeated throughout history. Empires that fail to recognize when the center of gravity shifts inevitably discover their mistake too late to prevent their own displacement. But the truth, however difficult, is the only thing worth examining. By the end of this analysis, you will understand why the Pacific power balance has already shifted in ways that military spending and aircraft carrier deployments cannot address. The nation we are analyzing is Indonesia. And if your immediate reaction is skepticism, if you are thinking that Indonesia lacks the economic scale, military capability, or institutional development to compete with China or balance American power, then you are operating with exactly the assumptions that have allowed this transformation to occur beneath the attention threshold of Western strategic planning. Let me be extraordinarily clear about what I am arguing tonight. Indonesia has, over the past 15 years, constructed the most sophisticated middle power strategy in modern geopolitical history. It has leveraged its geographic position, demographic scale, economic growth trajectory, and institutional architecture to become the indispensable balancing power in Southeast Asia. It has done this not through military buildups that trigger containment responses, but through economic connectivity, institutional leadership, and strategic non-alignment that makes it more valuable as a partner to all sides than as an adversary to any side. The numbers tell a story that most analysts miss. Indonesia is the world's fourth most populous nation with 277 million people. It controls the strategic waterways through which 40% of global maritime trade passes annually. Its economy has grown at an average rate of 5.1% annually for the past decade, despite global economic volatility. It chairs ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which collectively represents a 650 million person market and a $3.6 trillion economy. But these statistics, while impressive, do not capture the actual transformation. The real story is how Indonesia has positioned itself as the essential intermediary between China and the United States, between ASEAN and external powers, and between the competing visions of regional order that define contemporary geopolitics. Indonesia has mastered the art of strategic hedging, maintaining relationships with all major powers while preventing any single power from achieving dominance. Now, let me explain how this happened, because the process reveals lessons that apply far beyond Indonesia itself. The foundation of Indonesian strategy begins with geography, and this is where we need to understand something that Western analysts consistently underestimate. Maritime geography determines power projection capability in ways that military budgets cannot overcome. Indonesia is not a country. It is an archipelago of 17,500 islands stretching across 5,120 kilometers from east to west. This archipelagic geography creates both vulnerability and strategic advantage. The vulnerability is obvious. Defending 17,000 islands requires capabilities that Indonesia does not possess. But the advantage is less recognized. Controlling the choke points between the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean gives Indonesia leverage that cannot be replicated or bypassed. The critical passages are the Strait of Malacca, the Sunda Strait, and the Lombok Strait. 40% of global maritime trade passes through these waterways annually. That includes 80% of China's oil imports, 60% of Japan's energy supplies, and the majority of trade between East Asia and Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Here is what you need to understand about choke point geography. Whoever controls these passages does not need a blue water navy to influence maritime trade. Indonesia does not need to project power into the South China Sea or the Philippine Sea. It simply needs to maintain the credible capability to close or restrict passage through its territorial waters. This defensive geographic advantage creates asymmetric leverage that conventional military analysis misses. The United States learned this lesson in a very specific way in 1958, and this historical episode reveals the civilizational memory that shapes Indonesian strategic thinking today. In 1958, the CIA supported a rebellion against the Indonesian government, providing arms, aircraft, and training to separatist movements attempting to fracture the Indonesian state. The operation failed catastrophically, and one American pilot was shot down and captured, creating a diplomatic crisis that forced the Eisenhower administration to disavow the entire operation. But what matters is not the immediate failure of the operation. What matters is what Indonesia learned from this experience. The United States views archipelagic nations as inherently fragile, susceptible to divide and rule strategies, and therefore suitable targets for destabilization when their interests diverge from American preferences. This lesson has shaped Indonesian grand strategy for 65 years. Indonesia's response was to build institutional resilience and territorial integrity as foundational national security priorities. The military doctrine called the archipelagic outlook treats internal cohesion as the precondition for external influence. The government invested systematically in infrastructure connecting the islands, economic development reducing regional disparities, and institutional frameworks preventing the ethnic and religious fragmentations that Western intelligence agencies historically exploited. The payoff arrived in the 21st century when Indonesia emerged as the largest economy in Southeast Asia, the world's third largest democracy, and the chair of ASEAN during multiple critical periods when the organization had to navigate between Chinese and American pressure. Indonesia achieved this not despite its archipelagic geography, but because it built strategy around geographic reality rather than trying to overcome it. Now, the second dimension of Indonesian strategy involves economic positioning, and this is where the contrast with American approaches becomes instructive. When China launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, the United States responded with strategic anxiety, warning partners about debt traps, sovereignty erosion, and malign influence. The American counteroffer was primarily military, pivot to Asia, freedom of navigation operations, enhanced security cooperation. What the United States did not offer was the economic connectivity that developing nations actually wanted. Indonesia made a different calculation. It engaged with Belt and Road projects selectively, accepting infrastructure investments that served Indonesian development priorities while rejecting projects that created dependency or compromised sovereignty. The Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway represents this approach: Chinese financing and technology, Indonesian operational control, and domestic manufacturing requirements. But Indonesia simultaneously pursued infrastructure partnerships with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and yes, the United States, creating competitive dynamics where multiple powers bid for Indonesian partnership. The strategy was neither pro-China nor pro-America. It was pro-Indonesia, leveraging great power competition to extract maximum benefit while maintaining strategic autonomy. The numbers reveal the sophistication. Between 2013 and 2023, Indonesia received $43 billion in Chinese investment, $32 billion from Japan, $28 billion from Singapore, and $19 billion from the United States. Indonesia became the single largest recipient of infrastructure investment in Southeast Asia, not because it aligned with any particular power, but because it created the conditions where every power needed to invest to prevent competitors from gaining exclusive access. This is economic statecraft at the highest level. Indonesia does not have the GDP to compete with China or the military capability to balance against it. But Indonesia has something more valuable: geographic position and diplomatic skill that makes it indispensable to everyone's regional strategy. The third dimension involves institutional leadership, and this is where Indonesia has achieved its most significant strategic victory. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has often been dismissed by Western analysts as a talking shop producing lowest common denominator consensus that avoids addressing real conflicts. This assessment misses the actual function ASEAN serves for Indonesia specifically and Southeast Asian nations generally. ASEAN operates on the principle of non-interference in internal affairs and decision-making by consensus. These principles frustrate Western powers accustomed to using international organizations to pressure members on human rights, governance, or alignment issues. But for Southeast Asian nations with recent memories of colonialism and Cold War proxy conflicts, non-interference and consensus represent essential protections against great power manipulation. Indonesia chairs ASEAN more frequently than any other member and has used that chairmanship to establish norms, create institutional frameworks, and build regional consensus that serves Indonesian interests. The ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, released in 2019 during Indonesian chairmanship, represents the clearest articulation of this strategy. The outlook rejects both American and Chinese visions of regional order. It rejects the American free and open Indo-Pacific framework because that framework treats the region primarily as a theater for great power competition. And it implicitly rejects Chinese Belt and Road architecture because that framework privileges bilateral relationships between China and individual nations rather than regional institutional frameworks. Instead, the outlook proposes ASEAN centrality, the principle that regional architecture should be built around ASEAN institutions rather than imposed by external powers. This sounds like bureaucratic language, but the strategic implications are profound. ASEAN centrality means that any power wanting to shape regional order must work through ASEAN consensus, giving Indonesia, as the largest ASEAN member, effective veto power over regional initiatives. The United States initially dismissed the outlook as aspirational rhetoric from nations lacking the power to enforce their preferences. This was a catastrophic misreading. What Indonesia did through the outlook was establish the normative framework that now governs regional diplomacy. When the United States proposes regional initiatives, it must now frame them in language compatible with ASEAN centrality. When China pursues bilateral agreements, it faces pressure to reconcile them with ASEAN frameworks. Indonesia does not have the military power to exclude the United States from the Pacific or the economic power to compete with China for infrastructure dominance into Kaidar Sartibchus. But Indonesia has the diplomatic capability to set the terms of engagement, and in international relations, the power to set terms often matters more than the power to impose outcomes. Now, let me show you how this strategy has produced concrete results that are reshaping the regional balance in ways that conventional power analysis misses. In 2020, Indonesia negotiated a comprehensive partnership with China that included infrastructure investment, technology transfer, and maritime cooperation. That same year, Indonesia signed a defense cooperation agreement with the United States that included joint exercises, weapons sales, and intelligence sharing. In 2021, Indonesia deepened partnerships with Japan on infrastructure and with Australia on maritime security. Western analysts looking at these agreements saw contradictions. How can Indonesia be simultaneously deepening partnerships with rival powers? But this misunderstands the Indonesian strategic logic. Indonesia is not choosing sides. Indonesia is preventing anyone from monopolizing regional influence by ensuring that every major power has stakes in Indonesian prosperity and stability. The genius of this approach is that it transforms Indonesia from a prize to be competed over into a partner that everyone needs. China needs Indonesian cooperation to secure its maritime trade routes. The United States needs Indonesian partnership to maintain regional access and prevent total Chinese dominance. Japan needs Indonesia as a counterweight to Chinese economic influence. Australia needs Indonesia as a strategic buffer. Each of these powers could theoretically try to force Indonesia into exclusive alignment through economic pressure or military intimidation. But the cost of such coercion would be driving Indonesia toward the rival power, fundamentally weakening the coercing power's regional position. Indonesia has created a strategic equilibrium where every power's best option is continued partnership on Indonesian terms. This brings us to the military dimension, and this is where we need to challenge some fundamental assumptions about what military power actually achieves in contemporary geopolitics. Indonesia's military budget is $24 billion annually, ranking it 16th globally. Its navy operates approximately 200 vessels, but most are patrol craft and corvettes rather than capital ships. Its air force has approximately 300 aircraft, mostly older generation platforms. By conventional measures, Indonesia is not a military power capable of contesting control with China or projecting power alongside the United States. But this analysis misses what Indonesian military strategy actually attempts to achieve. Indonesia does not need to defeat China or project power across the Pacific. Indonesia needs to maintain credible defensive capability across its archipelagic territory and create sufficient uncertainty about the cost of coercion that major powers choose partnership over confrontation. The Indonesian military doctrine focuses on three core missions. First, territorial defense across the archipelago using asymmetric capabilities including coastal missiles, submarines, and island-based air defenses. Second, maritime domain awareness throughout Indonesian waters using patrol craft, surveillance systems, and coast guard capabilities. Third, internal security preventing separatism or extremism that external powers might exploit. These missions do not require technological parity with great powers. They require sufficient capability to impose costs that make coercion unattractive compared to cooperation. This is fundamentally different from the arms racing logic that drives American and Chinese military competition. The result is that Indonesia spends a relatively modest 2% of GDP on defense while maintaining strategic autonomy that far wealthier nations have surrendered. Compare this to the Philippines, which has defense spending below 1% of GDP and has effectively become dependent on American security guarantees, or to Singapore, which spends over 3% of GDP maintaining military capabilities it can only employ in coordination with larger powers. Indonesia has found the equilibrium point where defense spending is sufficient to maintain sovereignty without triggering the security dilemma that turns neighbors into competitors or dependencies that require great power protection. Now, the historical pattern that this situation exemplifies is one that empires throughout history have failed to recognize until catastrophic reversal makes it undeniable. Let me take you through the civilizational precedent, because what Indonesia is demonstrating is not novel. It is the reassertion of a pattern that has governed Asian geopolitics for millennia and was only temporarily disrupted by European colonial expansion. For 2,000 years, the dominant pattern in Asian international relations was not empire versus empire competition, but rather center-periphery relationships where powerful civilizational cores, primarily China, but also India, Persia, and various Central Asian empires, coexisted with tributary states that acknowledged symbolic hierarchy while maintaining substantial autonomy. The tributary system is consistently misunderstood by Western analysts who project European concepts of sovereignty and exclusive territorial control onto Asian historical patterns. The tributary system did not involve occupation or direct rule. It involved ritual acknowledgement of hierarchy, periodic tribute missions, and cultural exchange, while tributary states maintained internal sovereignty and often played multiple centers against each other. Vietnam provides the archetypal example. For over 1,000 years, Vietnam was nominally a tributary state to China. Vietnamese rulers sent tribute missions to Chinese emperors, adopted Confucian administrative systems, and acknowledged Chinese civilizational superiority. But Vietnam also maintained fierce independence when China attempted direct control, defeating multiple Chinese invasion attempts and occasionally sending tribute to competing centers when Chinese power waned. This pattern emerged because it served the interests of both centers and peripheries. The center gained symbolic acknowledgement of superiority and stable borders without the cost of occupation and administration. The periphery gained access to trade, technology, and diplomatic recognition while maintaining autonomy and the option to rebalance toward alternative centers when any single power became threatening. The European colonial period disrupted this system entirely, replacing fluid hierarchies with exclusive territorial sovereignty, and the Cold War extended this disruption through rigid alliance blocs. But the pattern now reasserting itself across Asia looks remarkably similar to pre-colonial norms. Major powers compete for influence rather than exclusive control. Middle powers maintain relationships with multiple centers simultaneously. Economic connectivity coexists with strategic hedging. Indonesia is not inventing a new model. Indonesia is adapting a civilizational pattern that governed Asian geopolitics when European powers were tribal kingdoms struggling with internal fragmentation. And this pattern has enormous advantages for middle powers in multipolar systems. The United States, shaped by European concepts of sovereignty and Cold War alliance structures, struggles to comprehend this fluidity. American strategists want binary choices. Are you with us or against us? Are you aligned or non-aligned? This binary thinking creates the perception that hedging equals hostility, when in fact hedging is the natural state of rational middle powers in multipolar systems. China understands this pattern intimately because it is embedded in Chinese strategic culture and historical memory. The Belt and Road Initiative is essentially a modern tributary system. China offers infrastructure, investment, and market access in exchange for diplomatic deference and acknowledgement of Chinese centrality. The difference is that contemporary middle powers like Indonesia have far more autonomy than historical tributaries because they can balance between multiple centers. What we are watching is the return of Asia to Asian patterns of international relations after 2 centuries of European and American imposed structures. This is not necessarily good or bad, it simply is. And the powers that adapt to this reality will maintain influence while the powers that resist it will find themselves increasingly marginalized regardless of military budgets or alliance frameworks. This brings us to the scenarios, and this is where we need to think carefully about what happens as this transformation becomes undeniable to Western policymakers who have thus far missed it. Scenario 1. The United States recognizes Indonesian centrality and adapts its regional strategy accordingly. In this scenario, American policymakers understand that preventing Chinese hegemony in the Pacific requires working through middle powers like Indonesia rather than attempting to force binary alignment choices. The United States offers the economic connectivity, technology transfer, and institutional partnership that would make alignment with American preferences attractive while respecting Indonesian autonomy. What would this require? It would require trade agreements that actually open American markets to Indonesian exports rather than demanding intellectual property protections that serve American corporate interests. It would require infrastructure investment at the scale of Belt and Road rather than modest symbolic projects. It would require accepting ASEAN centrality rather than insisting on American-led institutional frameworks. Is this scenario likely? Based on American political economy and domestic politics, no. The United States is structurally incapable of offering the economic concessions required because domestic constituencies block the trade openness and industrial policy that would make American partnership economically competitive with Chinese alternatives. The military-industrial complex drives American engagement towards security cooperation that Indonesia views as risking entanglement in great power conflicts. The United States will offer security guarantees, freedom of navigation operations, and military exercises. Indonesia wants infrastructure, technology transfer, and market access. This fundamental mismatch means Scenario 1 is implausible, absent dramatic American strategic reorientation. Scenario 2, the United States attempts to coerce Indonesian alignment through economic pressure and diplomatic isolation. In this scenario, American frustration with Indonesian hedging leads to punitive measures designed to force a choice. Trade restrictions, investment barriers, sanctions on Indonesian officials or companies conducting business with China, diplomatic campaigns framing Indonesia as unreliable partner. This scenario is possible because it aligns with American domestic politics, where China hawks increasingly view neutrality as complicity. The problem is that coercion will fail catastrophically because it will drive Indonesia toward exactly the Chinese dependence that American policy aims to prevent. If the United States punishes Indonesia for hedging, Indonesia's rational response is to secure Chinese partnership as insurance against American pressure. China will eagerly provide that partnership because exclusive access to Indonesia would represent the single greatest strategic victory in China's regional competition with the United States. Indonesian control of maritime choke points combined with Chinese economic dominance would effectively end American ability to maintain military presence in the Western Pacific. American coercion would thus achieve the opposite of its intention, transforming Indonesian strategic autonomy into Chinese alignment. I assess this scenario as moderately likely because American domestic politics increasingly drive counterproductive policies based on emotional satisfactions rather than strategic calculation. Scenario 3, China overreaches and triggers Indonesian balancing behavior. In this scenario, Chinese confidence in its economic leverage leads to demands that Indonesia views as threatening its sovereignty or regional leadership. This might involve pressure to support Chinese positions in South China Sea disputes, demands for exclusive basing rights, or attempts to undermine ASEAN institutions. Indonesia would respond by strengthening partnerships with the United States, Japan, and Australia specifically to counterbalance Chinese pressure. This is the scenario that American strategists often assume will happen automatically, and it is certainly possible. But it requires Chinese strategic error, and China has thus far demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Indonesian red lines. The most likely outcome is actually Scenario 4, which is the continuation of the current trajectory where Indonesia maintains strategic autonomy, deepens relationships with all major powers simultaneously, and gradually accumulates influence as the essential balancing power that determines whether the Pacific trends toward Chinese dominance or sustained multipolarity. In this scenario, Indonesia becomes progressively more important to everyone's strategy while committing exclusively to no one. The winner in this scenario is Indonesia, which gains investment, technology, and influence from all sides. The loser is any power-seeking regional hegemony because Indonesian hedging prevents the consolidation required for dominant position. The United States is not losing the Pacific to Chinese military expansion. The United States is losing the Pacific to Indonesian diplomatic sophistication that offers China, Japan, Australia, and middle powers throughout the region a more attractive alternative to American security dominance or Chinese economic hegemony. Let me now show you what this means concretely for the next decade of Pacific geopolitics. By 2030, Indonesia's GDP will reach $2 trillion, making it the 7th largest economy globally. Its population will exceed 290 million. Its infrastructure connectivity will integrate Southeast Asian economies more tightly than at any point since decolonization. And its diplomatic centrality will make ASEAN frameworks the unavoidable architecture for any regional initiative. At the same time, American relative power will continue declining not because of absolute American weakness, but because of Asian growth shifting the global center of gravity. China's economy will continue growing, but Chinese demographics and debt burdens will prevent the total dominance that seemed plausible a decade ago. The result is sustained multipolarity, where no single power can dominate and middle powers determine outcomes through their alignment choices. In this environment, Indonesia's strategy of maintaining relationships with all powers while committing exclusively to none becomes the model that other middle powers adopt. Vietnam has already begun implementing similar approaches. Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines are watching Indonesian success carefully. Even Australia, formerly allied with the United States, increasingly hedges through economic partnerships with China.